to episode 7 of my podcast, The Never Ending Experiment. This is Kim Anderson. Today I want to talk about something that's a little more complicated, which is saying no to having children. And the reasons behind that are numerous. And so I wanted to just go over that today. So the difference between an overpopulation activist, which is probably what I am, although I wouldn't say that I'm really overly active, but I want to focus on the networking and the communities of people that have developed now in relation to just rejecting childbirth, essentially, and why that's happening. Overpopulation activism is really based on science, and it's based on calculations that have been made. It's based on why we have so many environmental problems and social problems and so on, and relating that to just overcrowding and overshoot, which is two parts of overpopulation. Overconsuming can happen for different reasons. A lot of people get into the camp of either rich people are all to blame or high consumers versus it's all poor people that are to blame because they're high reproducers. And I don't really buy into that division very much. My expectations have changed a lot in the last 10 years, 20 years, and I think that's why I want to talk about it more too, because I think we're a little bit stuck in the past when we talk about the subject and using statistics from pre-millennium as opposed to seeing what kind of demographic changes are happening now and who's having kids and why. The other group of people that I want to talk about that are not having kids are child-free. They've kind of been getting a lot of attention recently because they just have chosen this lifestyle. They just don't want kids. A lot of them knew they didn't want kids when they were kids themselves. So that is really about a preference of lifestyle, and that is different than childless. And of course, most people don't really follow the proper definitions, but there are groups of people that have organized themselves around these terms. So child-free is just that desire to not be a parent. And not all child-free people hate kids. You know, it's not necessarily what it means. They just don't want to have their own. The other group of people that I want to just go over is antinatalists. And antinatalism has been growing as well. I myself wasn't really even very aware of them even while I was having overpopulation discussions. And I think just in the last few years, that sort of increased a little bit, and that's become also, organizations have been created around antinatalism as well. Basically, to summarize, what I want to do today is go over the idea of just a general anti-pronatalism. So pronatalism is this idea that it's always great to give birth and that babies are always wonderful and everyone should have one and everyone should want one and everyone should congratulate you if you have as many as you can. That's maybe an exaggeration, but essentially that's what it is. And there are a lot of people that are just very pro-birth. They just have been told over and over, and they have understood the miracle of life, and a new person is just always going to be a celebration and something positive. And it's a little bit naive to see it that way, and there's a lot of reasons why. For me, just being close to birth in life, like that happened once, that I was in the other room when someone was giving birth, and that changed me a lot. I think before that, I was kind of thinking probably the birth rate was going down and maybe overpopulation wasn't such a big problem. But in that experience, I realized just how terrible birth can be. And it wasn't what would be classified as a difficult birth. It probably would have been classified as a fairly normal birth. But it was so gruesome, and I didn't witness all of it. And I know people have fainted and had pretty extreme reactions to witnessing a birth. It's not a pretty thing. You know, you may enjoy certain aspects of it, I guess. I don't know. For me, if someone's in pain, that's not something that I like to be around or that I like to see. And certainly a new baby is something that is mind blowing. And I understand why people are so fascinated by birth. And I understand completely why people would want that. I myself am not a child free person. I would not classify myself as that. I would classify myself as childless because I did want kids when I was younger, but now I am very relieved that I don't have them. But that doesn't come from wanting them or not wanting them. That comes from dealing with the circumstances of life. So it's just coming to terms with who you are. You know, I also wanted really long hair when I was young. I did. I can't grow my hair out. It just can't happen. It's not built that way. So things like that you just get over. Life doesn't always give you exactly what you want. And for me to see how things have gone in the world and everything that's happening with my own health, I am very happy that I don't have kids. So even though I'm not child free, I am happy with how that is. And unfortunately, I think it maybe has made me less empathetic towards people trying to have kids because I know that it's something that you can get over. It really isn't necessary and it is very dangerous. I think the dangers of childbirth have really been downplayed. And I think more and more now, for the very reason that there are medical procedures which can save lives during childbirth, so that people that may have died in the past aren't dying from childbirth anymore. But that doesn't mean that that's automatically better for everyone, because what we're doing is we are taking away that evolutionary force that would prevent us from evolving in a direction or devolving in a direction where birth is actually getting more and more difficult precisely because of the interventions. Antinatalism as a philosophy is just exactly what that name implies. Natal meaning birth. It's the reverse of pronatalism. Antinatalism, on the other hand, sees life mostly as suffering. And because of that, bringing new life into the world just increases suffering. So why would you want to increase suffering? Why would you want your precious children and grandchildren to go through terrible things? Especially if the very desire to have them leads you to a type of birth that is more likely to have problems. So you're actually increasing the suffering through that desperation in wanting children. So that's something that I do agree with, but I would not call myself a pure antinatalist. And that's because I think that we could hypothetically get better at giving birth and at being human. And maybe not human. I mean, maybe this evolution we're going is into a different type of species. Pronatalism is so deeply embedded that people will actively and knowingly sign up to do dangerous scientific experiments on their own offspring because that's how desperately they want a child. And I'm sure if people are listening to this, some of you probably feel that way because that's how common this mentality is. But I don't get it. And I'm hoping that if that is how you think, you just take a listen to some of the other ideas and some of the other perspectives about why making birth more dangerous and more high risk is really, really going to cause problems, not just for your children, but, for the future in general, because the more that we wear and tear on our physical well-being now is going to lead to decreased health and well-being in the future as well. So it's worth it to try to make birth as healthy as possible if you're going to do it. And the reason why I'm not a pure antinatalist is because conception does happen naturally without our intervention. I mean, obviously, you have to get them in contact. You have to have sex, for example, in order for that to happen. But what I'm saying is that because it happens unintentionally, that people aren't intentionally trying to get pregnant necessarily, because those things are two separate acts. And that's why most sexual acts don't actually lead to pregnancy. We'll probably never know the exact number, but because of that, that means that the process itself, it's self-created by an egg and a sperm acting independently of the people that created them. That's why I can't be a pure antinatalist, because you could argue that that egg cell and that sperm cell did consent to life by combining. So even though it wasn't us as an adult human with the capacity to reason, it was life that has created you. And because that can happen spontaneously, that's why I think that it isn't necessarily always a bad thing to give birth. And also because a lot of births are healthy. It's just that saying that just because it's physically healthy, there's also a major psychological toll for a woman to become vulnerable, because all animals are vulnerable when they are giving birth. So because of that, it is never a positive for the woman in that moment, even if in the long run she will enjoy having a child, even if she intentionally was in that position, even if she doesn't have serious physical damage from it, there's almost always some level of damage and injury and vulnerability, and therefore physical disempowerment of a woman when she goes through pregnancy and childbirth. So that's why I still have a lot of that antinatalist feeling, but I do feel that because there can be kind of the perfect circumstance in which to give birth. Now, the child-free community has, I think, received the most press recently. There's been some conservative politicians that really don't like the idea of people just not wanting kids. So that's that pronatalist ideology coming out pretty strong. And it's come from a lot of different places, some of them surprising. I think we tend to associate pronatalism with the right wing or conservative political values, but I feel that it has become even more prominent in the left wing. And I think part of the reason why the other side, left wing or liberal, what have you, has to do with just the ideology on that side of just choosing and freedom and the empowerment of the individual to make their own choices. And I kind of get it, but that does come with a big issue. And that's the difference between parents and children. Now, the relationship between parents and children is so extremely one direction. Your parents are giving all of these things to you. You may or may not give it back to them. It's a risk they're taking. A lot of people abandon their parents when they get older, so it isn't necessarily the future insurance policy that you may think. And also the size difference. I mean, when you're an infant, you're a tiny little creature. You can't walk, you can't talk, you can't feed yourself. There's so many things that you can't do when you're an infant. So that relationship is the most unequal relationship of any human relationship. There is no consent to anything that happens to you when you're a baby other than, laughing and crying, which gives some sense of how you're doing. But of course, even if you cry and you protest, you still may not get your way. So the powerlessness of infancy, I think, is why antinatalism has such a big draw. And I think, too, that antinatalism, to me, it's hyper-rational. in the sense that it is like very, very reasonable to just push away this act of self-degradation and sacrifice, because it's always a sacrifice, whether for one parent or for both of them or other people that may be invested in an infant. So those people that are kind of in charge of it, of getting this birth to happen, and nowadays it could be any number of people, because we've commercialized the process of birth, which is basically a form of human trafficking and slavery, because an infant can never give consent. So from an antinatalist perspective, if I'm to go to like just the pure definition of that, which means no birth, right? They're against birth. Because of that, I think, damaging factor, that's why I'm not necessarily pro-choice, because for some people's ethical reasoning, you may look at, well, the individual should always be able to choose, but that ignores the individuality of the infant, who cannot participate in any of the discussions that may have happened amongst the adults in their creation. So the fundamental rights of that individual must come before all else, because that individual is the only reason, the only outcome that's desired by the other individuals. A group of individuals, or, a lot of people would say couple, but come on, let's get real. Like, artificial reproduction is out of control right now. It just amazes me how many people that are pro-natalist don't seem to view the new infant as a real individual human being with human rights. Back to the child-free person. The child-free attitude is very simple. I see it as a preference, no different to liking spicy food or preferring hot weather to cold weather. It's that kind of like very simple preference. That's how I see it. As like just a part of how you like to have your life, And what I think makes me scared and what makes me uncomfortable is that a lot of those people are being attacked. So the right wing encourages all kinds of birth, but the left wing is encouraging particularly high-risk births. And that's just so surprising to me, and that's why I can't align myself with a lot of the current left-wing or liberal parties. Now that's my own views outside of the groups that I'm talking about. Child-free people, amazingly, some of them that are purely child-free in the sense that they are also on that, what you might call the left-wing mentality, which is that it's fine if you want to give birth, but they just don't want to give birth or contribute to a birth, if they're a man. So that is very different. The child-free people may or may not have other different political beliefs. They may not be necessarily what you would call left-wing in other opinions that they have. And they aren't necessarily antinatalist, or they may not necessarily believe that overpopulation is an issue either. And I have read about child-free people that have contributed directly to artificial reproduction through egg or sperm donation or even surrogacy. So being child-free does not mean that you're against birth. That is a separate issue. If you're kind of outside of the mainstream left or right political discussion, you will get labeled as the opposite by the people on that camp. And that happens a lot. So I've been called far right or far left, the extremes of either, which are coming from the opposite extreme. So probably I would classify myself as a centrist, but really what it is that I really like to understand policies one by one in more depth before I make up my opinion. And I really don't like the political party system for the reason that they take a bunch of those different policy beliefs and categorize them into one package. And so it's like a television package now, when you get the cable subscription, it's these channels and you can subscribe to this program or that program, and there's a bunch of different channels. some of which you like and some of which you don't like, but you have to buy them all. And that's kind of what the political party system is. So when it comes to birth right now, every single party is pronatalist. Now, the one that should be questioning pronatalism the most, the Green Party, has really, really come down against even discussing overpopulation. Now, the biggest reason behind that, and of course, this is why discussing overpopulation is different than antinatalism or childfree, is that we get branded as racist for even talking about it. Now, the crazy thing about that is that it implies that the person talking about overpopulation has control over the actual statistics, or that they are only applying the statistics to some people or some races. But that's just patently false. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up. Overpopulation activism, unlike being child-free, which is a personal choice, and unlike antinatalism, which is a philosophy and an ideology, overpopulation discussions are about science. So they're really looking at what are the facts, what's going on, who's involved, and why are we not understanding that overpopulation is an issue. I think that in terms of academia, there has been a definite conspiracy to shut down overpopulation discussion based on the racist idea. Now, where that comes from is the fact that the birth rate from country to country isn't even or equal. So even that doesn't make it racist to discuss overpopulation, if you really look at that idea, because culture is really the number one thing that dictates birth rate. If it was certain circumstances that led to certain birth rates, those things are going to be very, very complicated. It's never one thing that changes the birth rate, just like it's usually not one thing that influences any individual or couple or group of people to try to have a child. So because of that very complex system of behaviors that lead to childbirth beyond just a conception happened and therefore a child must be born, beyond that, the circumstances that lead to that happening, of course, are complicated. And they do vary from country to country, and that's why the birth rate is so different. And the other erroneous assumption is that it's only black and brown people that have a high birth rate, which is ridiculous. And that comes down to, first of all, categorizing people purely through their skin tone, which is stupid. And the assumption that all places that are not white have a high birth rate, which is completely false. Now, the lowest birth rates in the world right now are in East Asia, Singapore, Japan. So all of this moaning and groaning about his plummeting birth rate doesn't take into account that, number one, the birth rate was very high last generation. They were part of the boomer generation, just like everyone. Once World War II stopped, people got together and they just started having as many kids as they could. It was just seen as a very positive thing. People wanted optimism and happiness after these terrible times of war. And that often happens after a war, especially a prolonged one like World War II, where that led to the baby boom. And not even everybody knows that that's why they're called boomers now. So the boomer generation is aging, and that was something that people have been scaremongering about for a while. But that's natural that there should be a boom. There was a baby boom. So now there's an old people boom. That just makes sense. And that will, of course, that will stop in the next generation. But what we're dealing with at a global level and at a scientific level in the ecology and the biology of life on Earth, that our increasing population is leading to the extinctions of many, many other species. That is the number one environmental problem. We are stealing the homes of other animals and plants when we wipe out the forests and we wipe out the grasslands and we wipe out the natural species that were there, and we take homes away from animals that were living there. In every case, in every time. In order to have more children and have more housing, we are making other species go extinct. And I think that's why they don't want to talk about overpopulation. So my antinatalism has a limit, and that's because I know that naturally occurring spontaneous pregnancies can happen, and there can be a healthy birth, and there can be a situation in which that child is raised with a decent level of quality of life. So I can't go against all of antinatalism just because that person might suffer sometimes, because I do know people that are very happy. And so because of that, I wouldn't want to take away the possibility of people having a good life if we humans can understand how to live on this earth without wiping everything else out except the small group of species that we want to eat. So I talked a little bit more about my own philosophy than I did about the other two, but I hope that I at least helped to make a distinction. I want more people to discuss overpopulation because I believe it is really, really important. But I think that we also need to look at everybody who is questioning the pronatalist narrative, which is that birth is always positive. Birth is dangerous. It is disempowering to women. A lot of women don't want to believe that because the experience of giving birth can be life-changing. It can be enlightening. It could be all kinds of things. And I'm not taking away from someone's experience of it. But from a physical and biological standpoint, it is a blow to the human being to have to go through the process of pregnancy and birth. And I think that's why we have to question it more. And we also have to question why we want so many babies. And that's going to lead to another discussion. This topic, by the way, of overpopulation is going to be in my next book. And that hopefully will be coming out probably in the next year or two. I've been working a lot on graphs, which I didn't do in my book that's coming out hopefully next month. But this next project, I'm really, really looking at numbers because numbers is science, and if you reject numbers because you don't like them, you really need to question why that is. And just avoiding discussion about a very serious scientific ecological disaster that we're creating, which is overpopulation and overshoot. Overshoot is kind of just the result of overpopulation. That we have used more resources than we are able to replace. So a lot of those resources need time to replenish, like organic materials. But a lot of those resources, like water, have their own cycle. And we use a lot of resources. We just can't help it. If we stopped using resources, we would stop feeling human. If all we did was eat, and went back to a sort of really, really simple lifestyle, we would probably lose out because our minds have evolved, our brains have evolved to have technology to figure out these sort of technical problems and physical problems and to make things, tool use. That's bred now within us. That's part of our instinctual nature as human beings. So as much as we have that, we need to be able to balance that out with being animals and the fact that animals need to be healthy. So really what I want, what my goal is, what I'm sort of saying is that health is important. And we do need to support our own health, and we need to support the health of the species around us and not damage them as much as we've been doing, and especially not to damage our own offspring through this desperate desire to have children. Hopefully you made it to the end of this. If you disagree with me, I hope that you reconsider. In order to progress as a society, we need to get smarter. And a lot of people have very different ideas about what smart is. But I think in order to be healthy and happy, we really do need to get better at discussing it without labeling people one way or another. And I think aligning yourself with certain philosophies just helps to understand your perspective. But I will stand behind child-free people and antinatalists in their effort to promote their own life decisions and why they are rejecting pronatalism and why I'm rejecting it too. Thank you for your time, and hopefully you stay listening, and I'll be discussing a lot of other subjects on the arts and sciences. This is Kim Anderson. Thanks. I'll see you again.